We are back in Europe, but now we are in the Balkans, Tirana, Albania. People should pay more attention to Albania and especially Tirana. They've been hard at work upgrading their infrastructure to benefit their citizens and have been leading the way in Europe for sustainable city design. The country is run by a former mayor of Tirana, Edi Rama, the prime minister, and the current mayor is exactly 40 years old. Many of his most trusted advisors within City Hall are even younger, including our honored guest, Joni Baboci, who is hands down the most engaging and passionate public speakers I've ever heard, especially when you get him talking about urban planning and development. Yoni studied in Toronto and then London at LSE for a master's in urban studies, so he is well acquainted with city life. Yoni started his career as an architect at a boutique studio in Tirana and in 2015 joined City Hall as Director of Planning and Urban Development. He has remained ever since and recently transitioned to a new title this summer, the Senior Urban Advisor to the Mayor. Good morning from Chicago, and thank you so much for joining today. I've read so much about you, so I'm so thrilled to finally speak to you. You are a self-described urban enthusiast. Why do you love cities so much?
Thank you so much, Jared, and thank you very much for having me. I think it's so interesting to talk to you about an issue which is very, very close to my heart. I think it's sort of a cliche to describe the importance of cities and their sort of expected growth in the next century as a cradle of innovation and the value they bring in balancing the consumption of resources and the waste of energy that currently pervades our planet. But I think that it's like, it feels a bit working with cities like investing in Apple in the 70s or in Google in the 90s. They're a platform. They're a platform for the future. I think they're the original platform of our civilization. They create opportunity and they close the gap of inequality. And I think that they're sort of a churning socioeconomic elevator. They are, in a way, the generator of the future of humanity. And I'm so happy to have dedicated and sort of worked for cities for most of my career. Different scales at different levels, but always sort of keeping in mind the importance that they hold, I think, especially for the next 30, 40 years, in a way, showing us the way and leading the way for humanity.
Wow, your energy has already gotten me more awake this morning. And for anyone listening, I'm sure they feel energized as well. Like, we should go work for cities. We should do something about urban planning. And you've been director of planning and urban development of Tirana for the past 5 years. Now with a new title, I understand, Senior Urban Advisor. What does your job for the city entail, and what are the main development projects you've been proud to complete in this period of time?
Yeah, so I have recently transitioned to an alternative role at the city. It's a bit less bureaucratic and a bit more creative. I'm currently advising the mayor in delivering cross-disciplinary change to the city in terms of how do we knit the urban planning, the architecture, urban economy, mobility, infrastructure together through information systems in sort of planning for the future of our cities. Previously, I was leading a team of more than 100 professionals, architects, planners, engineers, in sort of planning this bustling, vibrant capital that is Tirana. We delivered large-scale land use and planning documents, redesigning the growth of the city's urbanscape, having a lot of collaborative processes, a lot of innovative, I would say, flexible methodologies in terms of planning, how we think about cities. We delivered and coordinated very large-scale projects, including Skanderbeg Square, a really revolutionizing change in the center of the city. We transformed the biggest roundabout in the Balkans into a huge pedestrian space for people to enjoy. We're extending the city north in the new boulevard. We're transforming an old bazaar into a fantastic marketplace. We're transforming the mausoleum of the dictator of Albania 30 years ago into an innovative tech hub for youngsters to learn about innovation technology and sort of dip their toes, so to speak, into programming and coding at an early age, and therefore have the right skills for when they start to move on into the university education. So I think that Tirana changed a lot in the past 5 years, also because cities have been sort of getting that sort of attention. And it's been a fantastic ride.
Wow, I can't wait to see this all for myself, and especially the tech hub that you're describing sounds very exciting. We have many tech hubs that sound a little bit similar in Chicago. If you're not familiar, well, I hope you can come visit Chicago someday soon after COVID, but there's one in particular that comes to mind called 1871, and I've been there a few times myself, so if the one in Tirana is anything like that, it's very exciting for the city and I think for the whole country probably. Thank you for sharing all of those projects. I want to move into my favorite topic, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And considering that the Sustainable Development Goals were actually designed for national governments at the United Nations, why do SDGs matter for cities?
I think that especially in the past decade, we've seen all over the world the importance and the increasing responsibilities that local government has been taking over from central authorities. So in a way, I think it's only fitting that we have to see at the SDGs through the lens of the urban and through the lens of cities, of course. Even in looking at some of the most important SDGs, you look at number one, no poverty, right? We've been saying it for decades. And I want to mention this fantastic book by Doug Sanders called Arrival City. And it speaks about how cities are poor by design. If a city is successful, if a city works well, it attracts the people who are less well off because it's a cradle of opportunity. It's a huge potential. And therefore, even though, let's say, a city like Berlin might be statistically poor, the story changes if you look at the finer grain, if you look at the relative change of fortunes that happen in a city like Berlin. And therefore, what you see in a city is sort of a social and economic elevator. And therefore, if you want to tackle poverty, if you want to address poverty, I think it's the best way to do it is to dedicate the attention often to the cities. If you look at some of the other SDGs, decent work, economic growth, industry, innovation, infrastructure. I mean, the thing that comes to mind is, again, cities. They produce 85% of the global GDP. And in this context of growth and prosperity, I think it's an accepted fact that if we want to see change, we have to look at cities and we have to dedicate our attention to cities. And then finally, one that is extremely important for now, climate change, climate action, and then responsible production and consumption. I think, again, the environmental impact of urban areas is outrageous, which is good, but it's also bad. I mean, cities account, I think, for 75% of natural resource consumption and is between 60 and 80% of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we don't address these issues in cities, what's the point in looking at the SDGs? And therefore, I think it's more than important to focus the matter and to also look at it through the lens of cities. And I think that we're going to talk a bit later about the voluntary local review processes, which in a way address exactly these kind of issues.
Well, very well put. And I agree, a lot of things that take place in cities can be challenges, but I like to see the glasses half full always. So I do see them as opportunities as well. And hopefully, like you, I believe all 17 goals matter in cities. And that's why we're talking to each other today. Nonetheless, I do want to draw your attention to a very specific goal, which is number 11, sustainable cities. And furthermore, target number 3, indicator number 2, which measures success by the proportion of cities with direct participation structure of civil society in urban planning that operates regularly. So do you think Tirana is achieving this? And how does your office at City Hall engage with everyday citizens and community groups?
I mean, we're trying. I don't think we're achieving it, and I don't think there's a sort of fully checking the box, but we're definitely doing attempts for the past years to try and be as open and as inclusive as possible. We have a lot of in situ public hearings, so we've moved a bit away from having people come to City Hall, and we try to actually go to the neighborhoods where we have a project and try to hold the meetings in situ. We do a lot of co-designing, especially for smaller neighborhood scale projects, playgrounds and sort of small parklets. We have the community come out, especially children and young people. They come out and they try to help us, give us their idea, in a way identify the genius loci, the spirit of the place, which we don't know as planners living or working out of City Hall. But people who live in these neighborhoods, they know much better than us, and therefore they can tell us where they feel it's more appropriate to have a certain bench or even to have a small pedestrian sort of walkabout in the neighborhood. I think it's interesting because we often getting a bit more theoretical here on this issue, but I really want to mention it. There's this famous concept in planning from a fantastic US-based social worker journalist, Jane Jacobs, of eyes on the street, this idea of people improving their community by being active on the ground floor. And I think whenever people think of Jacobs, they have this idea of bottom-up processes, and that's where it ends. But if you look at one of the most interesting chapters in the Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is aptly named The Kind of Problem a City Is, she deals with issues of organized complexity. So she deals in how eyes on the street, how these singular elements really create a complex system we can't fully understand yet. We maybe can't measure, but it's beyond the qualitative. It's in a way something quantitative, but it's above our understanding for now. And I think that when we think of public participation through these eyes, I think we do service to it. It's about how can we have these non-linear processes, which maybe we can fully understand, but which with more people participating, with more people sort of giving their ideas, I'm sure that we're increasing the resiliency of these projects, not just by increasing the ownership of people who will use them, but also by making sure that we're listening and hearing more diverse opinions rather than the usually expert-driven top-down approach that we as planners tend to have in cities. So whenever I think about this, one thing that comes to mind, and this might be a bit architectural, but is Jeremy Bentham, this very famous philosopher. He also designed this idea of panopticon, this prison from where one guard could look at all of the other prisoners from one spot. And the idea of eyes on the street and participation is the direct opposite of that, where you don't have this top-down rationalistic controlling approach, but rather it's something that it emerges from the behavior of individual actors at the neighborhood level. And I think that in some of our projects, that's what we're trying to do. So we're trying to have this emergent process to our projects. We don't know, we go there with a very open mind, and then we try to have the project emerge and be designed by us being there. And then we stop. When we leave the site, we don't keep designing. It's what it is. It's what we have sort of defined with the community, and it ends there. And I think we've delivered more than 50 playgrounds in the last 5 years, more than one per month. And most of them have been designed through this process with a lot of friends, a lot of collaborators from all over the world. So it's been very successful. And you can see how the community, in a way, owns the spaces much more than other projects, which are a bit more artificial, a bit more clinical, in a way, designed by architects in their offices. And I think that especially for these smaller scale projects, the participation is key.
Well, it sounds like you are achieving this very specific goal and indicator. Wow, it must keep you very busy. But as if being director of planning for Tirana is not enough, you're also a circular economy consultant. What is a circular economy, and is there such thing as a circular city?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe there isn't, but there should be. I mean, modern economies have been operating for, especially since the Industrial Revolution, in a very take, make, and dispose model. So it's interesting to notice that if you look at London 300 years ago, it had maybe hundreds of thousands of people working in recycling. So they had all kinds of interesting names, but it was sort of part of the economy. So it was because of survival, but it worked in a way. It worked much better than today. And I think that the challenge on having a circular economy is how can we, in a way, make sure that we valorize and we add value at every step of this process, not just at the consumption one, but also when we take it, when we make it, and then when we dispose it. The current growth paradigm is unsustainable. I mean, of course, it is sustainable for a small minority in the developed world. But when we think about the global world that we're looking at, how cities are growing, especially in East Asia and in Africa, we clearly imagine this is not possible and this can't go on. So how can we change this current paradigm where we are basically minimizing costs through mass production and we're basically ignoring all of the externalities that are embedded in the product or in whatever service that we're providing? And it's important to notice that these externalities, they don't just disappear. They accrete, they precipitate in the environment in various forms. We breathe them, we drink them through our water, we eat them for our food. And so I think that the key concept in the circular economy is how can we make sure that we just don't focus just on recycling? How can we focus on reuse, on remanufacturing, on upcycling products? And therefore, coming out of that, of course, is the city. And how can we think about mobility? How can we think about buildings and infrastructure? How can we think about consumer products in a different way? And how can we make sure that cities can sort of start closing the loop in their daily processes?
Agreed. I just keep getting more and more energy, and you are so involved in so many things, which is inspiring to me. And so I want to ask you about another activity you've been involved in recently with other members of the Tirana municipal government. I noticed that you participated in the Bloomberg Harvard City Leadership Initiative. Can you please tell us about this program? And are there any similar programs that bring together and train mayors from around the world and their senior advisors?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic opportunity for us in Tirana. It was a program which, in the first session, I think it's now in its third run. In its first run, it had 40 mayors from all over the world, and I think 80 important government officials, so key actors in the respective city halls, organized by Bloomberg Philanthropies and Bloomberg Cities, organizations who have contributed a lot to rethinking and reimagining this world of cities. What it brings, it's bringing together all of these kindred spirits who are fighting the good fight all over the world, and then having them learn from one another. Of course, it's managed in a way. It's facilitated by amazing professors from Harvard and from other world-class universities. But the end game is to learn from one another, to create some coalitions, to create friends, but also to create partners, and to help one another sort of implement policies in their respective cities. I mean, the problems we deal with on a daily basis are extremely similar. There's differences in language, differences in culture, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to achieve, we discussed for the past 20 minutes now, are the same objectives. So I think that it's been fantastic, and I would definitely advise any city and any city official around the world to try and get part of that program or other programs. There's a fantastic program at the London School of Economics that does something similar, which we also have been very lucky to participate. There's a fantastic platform for local and also central government officials called Apolitical, and it's free, it's online, everyone can access it. It has constant workshops, constant courses, but also a whole load of resources from where city officials, especially ones starting out, can learn and sort of can share on the experiences of more senior officials like us.
Well, I want to get back to talking a bit about your day job. And you are an architect and urban planner by training, which is so amazing. And I have two questions stemming from this. One, how do we rethink the way cities are designed for a more sustainable future?
I mean, I think we touched a bit upon that when we talked about the circular economy, but one very interesting, I was having this fantastic drive yesterday in Albania from the city of Permet to the city of Pobrad, that's in the east. And we were listening with my partner to this podcast. And this fantastic American, well, I think he's British or American philosopher called Michael Sandel, he discussed about the difference between a market economy and a market society, and how in the past 30 years we have slowly integrated the two in a way. So it's great to have a market economy where, in a way, we incentivize a healthy market behavior in regards, especially in cities, in regards to housing, to mobility. But at the same time, how can we make sure that we can neutralize the inequality, having the market sort of transition into society can bring? So having, in a way, the market drive some things which were not designed to be driven by markets. And I think in cities, the idea of relationships, the idea of sort of a social aspect which pervades the city fabric is extremely important. And then the second thing, which I've been thinking a lot about recently, is connected a bit to what I was discussing before about Jane Jacobs and Eyes on the Street, is how can we think of cities as these complex adaptive systems? So how can we try and find the similarities with evolution, with biological systems, with ecosystems? And then how can we learn from these lessons and try to apply them to city planning? Which means how can we be as flexible as possible? How can we allow for scaling to happen in a way? And how can we make sure that we close that loop of economy, but also of social relationships? So I think it's definitely a difficult time, but also a very interesting time. As you mentioned, it's a huge opportunity to rethink cities and to try and come back post-COVID with a new approach to them. And hopefully we will be able, as city dwellers, to start implementing that vision slowly but steadily.
Definitely. And I really appreciate that you brought up social design, because I think in my mind, I only thought of the dimension of physical design, but you're so right that social design is just as important. And so my second part of talking about urban planning, the second question is, I've spoken to a few architects in my life, and so I'm sure that you have visions of grand new architecture across Tirana. How do you reconcile your architectural dreams, what you would want if there were no constraints, with what funding is available to execute on those dreams?
That's such an interesting question. And I would say before addressing the funding aspect, I think what really sort of tickles me in that question is this idea of the vision and how arrogant we are in terms of as architects and planners, not as you asking the question, as us sort of trying to answer it, in terms of thinking of these top-down approaches where an architect or a planner has an idea and then it tries to make it happen for the hoi polloi in the cities who get to live it. So I think that the key aspect, I think, is to think of our roles as support, as not as a midwife for cities. So we're not there to, in a way, implement our visions as planners and architects. I think we're there to deliver what the people who will use those infrastructures need. So our challenge is not to draft our interesting sketches, but it's more to understand the psychology and as you said, we called it the sort of the social aspect of how these spaces need to work. Of course, there's a lot that you can do with little money, and I think Tirana is a fantastic example that illustrates that. Keep in mind that our yearly budget we were able to quadruple it in just 5 years, mostly by taxing new development. But at the same time, it's still extremely low. So it's less than $100 per person per year. And that's our total budget, dealing with the police force, dealing with fire, education. And then you still are able to deliver. I think a lot of the projects, our most successful projects that we can deliver on is how can we, in a way, leverage whatever taxes and tariffs we can get from the private sector, but how can we leverage locally? So if we have a new development in a certain neighborhood, how can we make sure that we reinvest the income that we get from the development into the same neighborhood? And how can we also get the developer to pitch in a bit and contribute with a small park or with a small playground? So I think that the bigger the dream, the more interesting it is to finance it with innovative ways, rather than the typical sort of connection that people usually make with public funding and sort of public works.
Well, thank you for for describing it from your perspective. Always so interesting to hear a perspective. Maybe you're coming in with one expectation of what would be said, and then it's slightly different. And I think it's just indicative of, your innovative mindset, but how innovative Tirana is as well. And so I want to build on that. Last year, you wrote a wonderful article titled "Architects and Urban Designers Need to Listen to Their Children." Interesting. Why should we design cities with youth at the center?
If you're designing for children, you're designing for all ages. There's nothing that is good for children and is not good for someone else. I think that it's a fairly undemanding proposition. It's something that is fairly simple, but because of the answer I just gave before, so this idea of a vision, of a grand vision that you want to implement, and these sort of big visions, sometimes they, in a way, remove the simplicity aspect that some of these ideas have. So I think that, again, listening to children in Tirana has been one of our most interesting and most successful projects in terms of how can we, in a very simple way, design a successful playground, and how can we have a kids city council, and how can we have fun art on the street. So whenever we're walking with a young kid, he can interact with the street. It's not just the city is a playground. It's not just a project. And I think that, again, it's about a mindset. It's about a mindset which goes beyond City Hall. It goes about private architects, private planners working other parts of the city. And I think we've been successful in sort of communicating that approach. Our mayor, Arion, has a fantastic saying: our most difficult infrastructure project is just 10 centimeters long. It's the distance from one ear to the other. It's the mentality, the sort of the mindset that you go into a certain project. And therefore, I think that if you are able to have an influence into that mindset, then it goes beyond City Hall. It becomes sort of a citywide aspect. And I think that we've been fairly successful in generating that buy-in with a younger generation here. One fantastic example has been recycling. So plastic bags became illegal in Tirana a couple of years ago. The most effective way to communicate that was to actually educate young children who would then become, in a way, small revolutionaries of the circular economy in the family. and they would sort of, they would be the police telling the father to not throw a plastic bag in the sort of brown box and so on. So I think that is an interesting and very important mindset to involve non-voters into policy, because they have no agenda. I mean, children don't have an agenda. They know that they won't impact in a way policy making by just talking, and therefore I think it's interesting to have that perspective, and ideally to be driven by that perspective, to have that sort of drive. Because as I said in the beginning, if you're designing for kids, you're designing for all ages. You're designing for seniors. You're designing for people who might have a disability. You're designing for all kinds of social and economic backgrounds just by doing that one exercise, thinking with kids as a sort of a driving factor in design.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. But as they say, common sense is not common to everyone, I guess. And I'm so excited to hear that you had this initiative training children about recycling, because you're right, they do have so much influence in the home. They can change the behavior of their parents and consumption patterns more widely. And a quick follow-up, you mentioned a kid city council. Is that just an idea you have, or is that something being implemented in Tirana?
Yeah, we have held a city council meeting just with kids once a month for the past 5 years. The mayor also has weekly meetings with different classrooms from all over the schools in Tirana. They just come and visit City Hall. And in a way, they get excited about, in our part of the world, politics is not nice. Now, also in your part of the world, I guess it's sort of we're globalizing in that sense as well. But here, it has never been something that people would like to engage. It's seen as something, it's either very dirty and corrupt, or it's something that doesn't really give you a lot back. And I think that having kids come into City Hall and sort of meet the mayor, meet some of the key city staff, spend a day and look at how things work, I think it's interesting. It gives them another perspective from what they would get from media most of the time, and it maybe lights that spark, which in 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years might be the thing that makes them fantastic public officials or mayors in Tirana and other cities of the thing.
Definitely. I love sayings, and one of them, it's not very formal, but you don't know what you don't know is one of my favorite sayings. And so this is what you're describing with young children who you're inviting into City Hall. I would have loved something like this when I was younger, because I never knew anything about federal government, let alone local government, and exposure is so key. Going with the theme of you don't know what you don't know, I mean, you're just giving them exposure and other options to think about. And I agree about hindsight is 2020. That's another saying about you never know 10 or 15 years down the road. That could have been deeply ingrained in them from the experience. And then, when they're studying in university or going for their master's or whatever it is, what they learned or saw that one day 10 years ago is really a determining factor in their life rate. So, and we're still talking about young leadership, which I'm so excited about. Tirana was named European Youth Capital for the year of 2022. Congratulations. Assuming that coronavirus will have subsided by then, we all hope. What do you guys have planned?
I mean, we're so extremely excited about this. It's been we've been applying for this for a while. So finally we got it. 2022 is going to be the year when the youth of Europe are going to come and visit Tirana in droves. I think that it's a fantastic city. It's a very, very vibrant and diverse city. It's cheap, so you can have a lot of fun. You don't have to spend a lot. And I think that we have amazing activities planned from this huge campus in the city, which we will sort of host all kinds of cultural, culinary, and entertainment activities for people coming to visit. We have a lot of artist residencies spread throughout the country and throughout the city, tours. So it's gonna be fantastic, and I'm sure that by then we will have beaten the small and very problematic challenge that we have in COVID. But yeah, I mean, we in Albania, we often get a bad rap in the press, especially in Europe. People tend to focus on, we're a small country of 3 million. Often, as in most of the world now, news is mostly done for headlines, not for information. So we can't wait to have people actually be here. In my experience, whenever a foreigner has visited, they have come back because it's such a welcoming and fantastic place. So yeah, that's also an invitation to you to come and visit, maybe even early 2022, in a way, experience Tirana a bit and the fantastic vibrancy of the city.
I definitely hope so. And let's make it the most well attended and engaging European youth capital. And I'll be an honorary European for 2020, for 2022. Finally, moving into the final phase of our conversation for today, hopefully not forever, but getting back to sort of SDGs and city plans. So let's start with city plans. I have reviewed TR030, if that's how you call it. The general local
TR030.
plan. TR030, thank you. That's more official. TR030, the general local plan of the city of Tirana. It is very unique, in my opinion. The team started with an artistic piece called The Allegory of Good and Bad Government, which is a fresco by Ambrosio Lorenzetti. This plan, which was completed in 2016, has 3 phases. 1, the Metropolitan fresco based on 10 major themes. 2, the Atlas consisting of 13 strategic projects. And 3, the Guidelines Charter, whose draft represents the 3rd phase of the plan's implementation. Can you tell us more in your own words about TR030? What was the inspiration behind it, and how is it progressing?
Yeah, I mean, this would take like a whole episode to talk about this, the most interesting project that we dealt with in Tirana. I think that it's about connecting the threads of what I've been talking about today. I think it's about, of course, you need to have sort of a vision you communicate, and that's the fresco. That's sort of an image which talks about themes of good governance, of themes of green infrastructure, of energy efficient mobility, of accessible housing, and so on. But at the same time, beyond that, you need some concrete projects. What often land use plans lack is that it's just sort of a document, and most plans don't get realized. Not even 5% of the plan gets realized. So the idea that we had was, of course, we have this idea, this vision, which is very, very flexible. It's nothing it's nothing too concrete. But then we also have these projects, which are a bit larger scale. They're ambitious. There's a huge green belt. One of them is a green belt around Tirana, which serves as a linear park. Another one is how can we have as much biking as possible in the city, and how can we really shift the way that mobility works. Another of them is how can we use schools as the centers of neighborhood and the centers of community. So we are building 17 new schools as community centers. They're supposed to work most of the day. So they work in the morning as schools, and they work as a computer room, as a chess club, but not just for the students, also for the citizens that inhabit the community. So this is the idea of projects, something which is pretty big in scale, but it's also medium to long term. And then we have our charter of rules and regulations. These are extremely flexible rules. These are not the typical static rules you would see in a typical plan. It's about how can we be transparent, how can we be fair, how can we remove any sense of arbitrarity from development, but at the same time, how can we allow a local architect to actually express his creativity? So how can we make sure that we are balanced, and at the same time, I don't want to get too technical into this conversation. It's about how can we use form-based rules rather than typical quantitative rules. You can only build a certain amount of meters square. No, how can we allow the architect that within certain bounded limits, he can be a bit more creative and a bit more sort of contributing to the vision of the city. So I think it's a fairly complex document made up of hundreds of sort of rules. I think it thrives into the gradient. It's not black or white. It's powerful because it allows different shades of different colors to emerge in the city, both by private and public entities.
Wow, I'm just so impressed by Tirana and the work that you're leading. And we have finally arrived at our last question. After hearing you describe TR030, I did want to ask if Tirana has a plan to conduct a voluntary local review, which is specific to measuring a localized set of SDGs.
It's interesting. I think the first voluntary local review was held by New York City in 2018. And that's the same year that we completed sort of a subsidiary to our general local plan. So subsidiary to TR030, which is called the Green City Action Plan. It was financed by the World Bank. And in a way, it tried to quantitatively measure the objectives of TR030 in terms of sustainable mobility, in terms of green spaces, sustainable energy, resource management, climate change resilience, and so on. It's a very interesting document which actually goes a bit into the quantitative. So it has sometimes very well defined measures of how can we actually tell if this plan is having an actual impact and is actually fulfilling its vision and its strategic projects. But we are more than interested in conducting VLR, especially in terms that we can try and connect a lot of the lessons we learned from the Green City Action Plan and also a lot of the data we have already gathered and try and see how they match to a lot of the SDGs and their all the corollaries in terms of indicators. Regardless, I think that as you have put throughout this conversation, I think the strategy shift towards subnational governments in terms of how can we implement and measure the performance of SDGs, I think it just illustrates the heightened role that cities have for the future of our civilization. I think the challenge that we have is to find the right balance between quantitative in a way and qualitative in the Jane Jacobs sense, so emergent in a way. So how can we make sure that these indicators actually give rise to a city which is larger than the sum of its parts? So how each of those individual interventions in a way are not just a sum of these interventions, they're much more. And I think that is the challenge that these exercises often have. And I think that's a challenge for all of us to try and resolve. And starting by trying to unpack that complex problem through a voluntary local review based on the SDGs is definitely something interesting that we will absolutely have in our future priorities. Also, thanks to you and thanks to the conversation that we're having together.
Great. I look forward to following that journey, and I'm sure you will, but I will encourage you again to meet and talk to a lot of young people in carrying out that voluntary local review, especially your very smart and energetic university and even high school students who always want to gain experience in data analysis and writing. They can definitely help you out. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I mentioned a bit this idea of the pyramid, this mausoleum of the dictator. And the concept there is exactly this. How can we empower children or young kids who are 12 to 16 years old? How can we give them the right skills so then they can put them to good use when they're studying at a higher level? Or how can they move directly with a bit of programming, a bit of data science, a bit of design into assisting us into sort of pushing these priorities forward?
Great. Oh my gosh, what a wonderful conversation. And I hope this inspires other cities and other young people to get out there and contribute to sustainability in their city.
Thank you so much, Jared. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. I really hope that I at least imparted a bit of the interesting things we've been doing in Tirana, and can't wait to listen to all of my other colleagues and like-minded peers talk about these issues in your fantastic podcast.